In this lesson, we're going to consider the relationship between the marginal product of labor and marginal costs. Recall the marginal costs were what went into computing the supply curve, and so here we're going to say that ultimately it depends on the marginal product of labor. The marginal product of labor comes from the production function, and you'll recall the production function is just a relationship between the firm's output and the firm's inputs. We're going to think about the marginal product of labor as the extra product you get from an additional unit of labor input, whether it's an hour or a day or a worker. That's the marginal product you'll see is the extra product. And we're also going to see a very important phenomenon called the diminishing returns to labor, which will simply mean diminishing marginal product of labor as more is produced. Marginal product of labor decreases with more labor input is the definition of diminishing returns to labor, and we're going to see why and how that occurs. Let's start again with the production function, with an example of crates of production of, say, pumpkins. As you can see in this little example in this table, as the amount of production increases from 0, 1, etc. up to 5, the amount of labor input to get that increases as well. For example, for producing 2 requires 5 hours of labor input. Producing 5 requires 30 hours of labor input. More labor input means more output. Now note, the changes in labor input change as more is produced. It takes only 2 hours of labor input to move production from 0 to 1, but it costs 12 extra hours of labor input to move production from 4 to 5. That's diminishing returns to labor we're talking about, diminishing marginal product of labor. But let's see it more carefully by looking at a plot of the quantity produced depending on the hours of work. So on the horizontal axis, you got the hours of work. On the vertical axis, the quantity produced. And the black dots are just what came from the table. It shows you how much labor input is required for 1. That was 20 hours, if you recall, and it just goes up. Now, just by glancing at this curve, you can see that the extra product you get for a given amount of work gets smaller over time. That's the marginal product you get from additional hour of work gets smaller over time, and by the amount that's produced. So at this low levels of production, you get a relatively high marginal product of labor. At high levels of production, over in the upper right, you get a smaller amount of output for each amount of labor input. These little lines here try to illustrate that. So the distance there is the same as the distance here. So that's a certain amount of increase in the hours of work. But at low levels of production, that gives you a bunch extra output. But up here, just a teeny bit. And so the marginal product, the extra product you get from an additional unit of work, is much smaller at these higher levels of output than at lower levels of output. That's what we mean by diminishing marginal product of labor, or diminishing returns to labor. You can now think more carefully about why marginal costs increase for this firm, and that's where the supply curve comes from. So if you look at this table, we're going back to the production function on the left. We're computing total costs based on variable costs and fixed costs. You can see the total cost number there that was necessary for deriving profit maximization. And that same production function, from which we're deriving the marginal product of labor and showing that it diminishes as more is produced, is in this table. Now, recall that the marginal cost came from changes in total costs. In the table here, we see how total cost depends on the total product of labor. So the increase in marginal costs, which we've talked about in the previous lesson, is intimately related to the diminishing returns to labor. The reason why marginal costs increase is because the returns to labor diminish over time. To produce an extra unit of output requires more and more labor input, and that means more and more costs, and that means increasing marginal costs. So once again, increasing marginal costs are due to the fact there is diminishing returns to labor. And as you recall last time, that increasing marginal costs is at the heart of the supply curve as we've derived it before. And so at the heart of the supply curve is diminishing returns to labor. And that's what we gather and gain from this discussion. Thank you.